Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark. We're in Nehemiah chapter 2. We're going to be looking at verses 19 and 20 this lesson. But before we begin, Jeremiah 15:16, Thy words were found, and I did eat them, and thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, we saw last lesson that Nehemiah, he goes and he views the city walls. He sees the condition that they're in. And probably the next day, because he goes that night, he and several men go with him, and they go and they view the wall. And then it was during the night when no one else could see, so that no one would know what he was up to. And like I said, it's probably the very next day when the sun comes up, he gathers the people together and he shares with them his vision of building this wall. And he uses two ways to appeal to these men to rebuild this wall. And the first one is the shame of the city, the way it looks. It's broken down. It's a shame. And the other way is that, hey, God's hand, God has called me to come here. God is on our side. And not only that, but the king also, King Artaxerxes, he's on our side also to rebuild this wall. I have support from King Artaxerxes and from God to rebuild this wall. So let's do it. So now the people are motivated and they want to go and they want to build this wall up. But now verses 19 and 20. And it says here in verse 19, but when Sanballat, the Horonite, and Tobiah, the servant, the Ammonite, and Geshem, the Arabian, heard it, they laughed us to scorn, and they despised us, and they said, what is this thing that they do? Will they rebel against the king? Now, Geshem, the Arabian, we haven't gone over him yet, but Geshem, the Arabian. Now, Geshem is also seen in chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. And in chapter 6 and verse 6, we see that his name, Geshem, changes to Gashmu. Now, there are a couple different views as to the details of Geshem, who this man Geshem is. The first view of who this man Geshem is that Geshem possessed authority in the land of Idumea. Now, Idumea is south of the land of Judea. If you get your Bible and you turn to the back where the maps are, you look for Idumea, and Idumea is directly south of the land of Judah. So it's believed that Geshem had authority in the land of Idumea, south of Judea, and that he, being an Arabian, was the leader of an army of Arabian soldiers. It doesn't seem possible that this view of Geshem is actually the one that's right, because these three men, which is Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem, were somewhat closely connected in their opposition to the Jews. If you want to find out, you look at chapter 4, verses 1 through 7, chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, and chapter 6, verses 12 and 14. And you're going to see that Geshem is included with Sanballat and Tobiah. Now, it is not likely that Geshem would make trips up to Samaria from Idumea on these occasions of teaming up with Sanballat and Tobiah to oppose the Jews. So if Geshem really was really had a position of authority in Idumea, it doesn't seem possible that he would make that journey. Every time that they were going to oppose the Jews, he would have to travel all the way up to Samaria and travel back, then travel all the way up to Samaria and travel back. And it takes weeks for them to travel just one distance up and one distance back. So it's not likely that that view is the proper view of Geshem. But there's another view, and that is this, that the other view is that Geshem was the leader of an Arabian company of men in Sanballat's region, in Samaria, and that he was in the service of Sanballat, or at least he was available to Sanballat. So it seems more likely that Geshem, the Arabian, who had an army of Arabian men, that they were located not down in Idumea, but they were located up in Samaria, and that he either he was under Sanballat's rule, or he was at least available to Sanballat when Sanballat needed him and his army. Now, this would better explain how the three men would meet so often in their plans to oppose the Jews, because they met quite often. And it's very unlikely that Geshem would travel from Idumea up to Samaria each time they were going to oppose. So Geshem's details are not exactly known, but it is very interesting that the three men who are mentioned represent all the land surrounding Jerusalem, except the west. So first we have Sanballat. Now Sanballat is a Horonite. We went over that a few lessons ago. He's a Horonite, and he's from the land that is directly north of Jerusalem. So Sanballat represents the Gentile people north of Jerusalem. Then we have Tobiah. Now Tobiah is an Ammonite, and Ammon is the land east of Jerusalem, across the Jordan River. So Tobiah represents the Gentiles east of Jerusalem. And then Geshem is an Arabian, and Geshem represents the Gentiles that are south of the land of Jerusalem, of Israel. So these three men represent the north, the east, and the south. You may say, what about the west? Well, we're going to get to the west in a few lessons. We're going to get to the west side, and there eventually you'll see they'll be completely surrounded. Now, he says here, Sanballat says, what is this thing that you do? And then he says, will you rebel against the king? When a Christian turns away from the Lord and God gives them over to their rebellion, they become a slave to a new king, which is their old sin nature and Satan's kingdom. God does this so that the sin and the bondage will be a kind of chastisement to bring the Christian back to God. Now, we see an example of this in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 20 with Hymenaeus and Alexander. Now, it is believed that both Hymenaeus and Alexander were both saved. Why? Because the judgment that Paul puts on them is not the same judgment that would be for an unsaved person. If you're interested in going to that lesson and listening to it, you can go to my YouTube channel and go to my lessons on 1 Timothy. And when you get to 1 Timothy, you find the lesson for 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 20 about Hymenaeus and Alexander. Now, again, many people, many Christians and teachers believe that Hymenaeus and Alexander were not saved. And maybe it's possible they weren't. But the way that Paul pronounces judgment on Hymenaeus and Alexander seems that it's very possible that they were saved, but they had gone astray, and that they had actually turned against God. And now it's like Paul and God, they want Satan to chastise them. Satan to chastise them for their rebellion and for their turning their backs on the things of God. And this is kind of like what happens to a Christian when they turn their backs over and over again, like the children of Israel. They rebelled against God. They worshipped idols, and they killed the prophets. And over again, God would give them into a hand, like to their Gentile nation, and they would cry out, they would repent, and God would save them. And eventually God said, that's enough. That's enough. You're going to go into captivity for 70 years. So eventually God gave them over to their rebellion. It doesn't mean God hated them. Doesn't mean God, they lost their salvation or anything. They didn't stop being their chosen people of God. But it means that God, out of love, was trying to continue to draw them to himself, and they just kept rebelling. So he gave them over to their sin. And now God, the enemy is the one that's chastising. God is using the enemy of the Jews to chastise them. And sometimes that's what God does to us when we turn our hearts from God. God gives us over to that sin, and that sin is used by God as a chastisement to us. For what purpose? To draw us back to God, to chase us back into God's love and God's forgiveness. Basically, Paul is delivering Hymenaeus and Alexander to Satan so that Satan would be used by God to teach these two men not to blaspheme. Satan is here being used by God to dish out punishment in order that they would desire to return back to God. So God is using Satan as a tool of punishment against Hymenaeus and Alexander to turn them back to God. Again, you can go and listen to 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 20, and it explains it there. Now, as a backslidden Christian begins to repair their relationship with God, there will always be voices of threats saying, "Will you rebel against the king? Your king is not going to like this, and there will be trouble to pay." But the returning Christian needs to always keep their eyes on the King of all kings. Keep your eyes on the King of all kings. Verse 20, "Then answered I to them, and I said to them, the God of heaven, he will prosper us. Therefore, we, his servants, will arise and build. But you have no portion, nor right, nor memorial in Jerusalem." Now, Nehemiah here answers his adversaries, but he does not lean upon the arm of his own understanding, but he goes straight to the source of the reason why he was there to build the walls, and that was the God of the heaven wanted them built and would provide and protect them while they built. So Nehemiah doesn't say it's in my strength. No, I'm here. We are here building this walls because it's God's will. Our God has called us to build these walls. And we are doing this by the strength and by the authority of our God. You know, Any work or any service that we do for God is ultimately God's work, and it's God's service. It is not us doing things for God, but it is God working through us to fulfill his word. Don't be afraid to let the opposition know that God is behind the work. When you're doing a work for God, whether it's missionary, you're starting a Bible study, or you're starting a children's ministry or a nursing home ministry, whatever it is, don't be afraid to let people know that you're doing this because this is God's work. God has moved on your heart. You believe God is in this. And don't put yourself in it. Don't say this is what I want to do and I feel good about it and I this. No. It's God's will. This is a work of God, and you're just a tool in God's hand to minister to these people. Isn't it interesting how Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem found out about this work before they actually started rebuilding in chapter 3 and verse 1? Either Nehemiah approached Sanballat with the letters from the king to provide support by giving them timber. We see that in chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. Remember, when Nehemiah left Shushan and was going to Jerusalem, before he left, he asked the king, please give me letters so that I can have, for the governors across the river, so that I can have timber and things to build the walls and the gates and the doors and the locks and all these things I need. So when Nehemiah came down towards Jerusalem, did he show these letters to Sanballat on his way down to Jerusalem or not? We don't know. But somehow Sanballat found out they were going to build these walls before they actually started building. So it says here, with the letters from the king, that to provide support by giving them timber, or among the people that he told his plan to in chapter 2, verses 17 and 18. There was maybe someone who went and told Sanballat. So maybe it's possible that when he, explained that one of the persons that he took with him that night to view the walls, maybe one of them got word out to Sanballat, or maybe one of the people who they, shared the vision with about building the walls the next day. Maybe they went and they told Sanballat, but somehow he found out. And Nehemiah says to them, he says, you have no portion or right or memorial. Now, the enemies of the holy city have no right or privilege in it. The greatness and the majesty of the city are not their portion in this life. And so also, enemies of your soul or of your walk with God have no portion in the new creation that God has made you. The enemies of your soul, they have no portion in the greatness that God has made you. They have neither part nor lot in this matter. That's what says in Acts chapter 8, verse 21. The unsaved world has no claim on salvation, on righteousness, or on any of the holy things of God. The unsaved will be on the outside of the New Jerusalem, kept out by the walls, because they did not take the opportunity to become a part of God's family. As a Christian begins to build and to rebuild the walls around their heart. They must not let anything from this world to either help or to distract the building process. Remember, this world has no portion in the things of God. You have to understand that. This is why he says what? Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but it is of the world. And the world passes away, and the lust thereof. But he that does the will of God abides forever. Listen, the world, this unsaved world, has no portion in the holy things of God, in the blessings of God. It has no portion in it at all. No portion in salvation, no portion in God's righteousness or his holiness or his sanctification. They have nothing. They claim nothing in it. And this is what he says to him. This is what Nehemiah says. The God of heaven, he will prosper us. Therefore, we, his servants, will arise and build. But you have no portion, no right, nor memorial in Jerusalem. Why? Because this is God's house. This is God's city. And you are God's holy temple. The world has no portion. Listen, don't spend your time in this. Don't spend your time giving your life to this world. Why? Because he gets nothing back. All you get back from the world is death. The only thing you're going to get back from this world is things that will hinder you in your walk with God. Don't seek your treasures in this world. Seek treasures of God. Seek the blessings of God. Give your heart to the holy things of God. You're going to be there. You're going to be in heaven soon. I don't care if you have 30, 40, 50 more years to go. That's a drop. That's a twinkle of the eye. That's all that is. 50 years, just a twinkle of the eye. We need to give ourselves and live this life that we had, the time that we have on this earth. We need to live this life for the holy things of God, for the sacred things of God, because that's where the blessings are. And this world has no lot, has no claim on the things of God. All right, we're going to continue in chapter 3, next lesson. But until then, walk with the Lord. I know he walks with you.